Hi, I'm Stephen Carson coming at you from St. Louis, Missouri in these United States. I had this adjusted down a little bit because of my shorter wife, so let me fix it. Okay, here we go. Maybe that's a little more like what I should be doing. I don't know. Sorry, just realized I had messed with my camera. Okay, all right. Uh, Continuing with the left-wing terror series, I'll be on my own this week. Speaking of which, let me get that name fixed. I'll be on my own this week in the sense that I won't have a co-host, but I have to say I'm not on my own in regards to this topic. I was, this was really brought home to me in particular by a friend named Charles Ford, a late friend who was very interested in the history of the persecuted church in the 20th century. And because history is written by, the victors, the magnitude of the persecution of Christians in the 20th century is not well understood even by most Christians. Certainly, I did not realize the extent to which Christians in the Soviet Union were persecuted. I mean, I knew they were persecuted, right? But I had no idea. Just stunning. So we're going to get right into it. I'll just say that this show is supported through generous, modest, but regular, generous donations, mostly through Subscribestar, which is a great site that doesn't kick our friends off. And some people are more generous than this, but most of the supporters of the channel contribute a measly $5 a month. And but enough people do that, starts that up. So thank you for that. Very, very helpful. Also, there is a public Bitcoin wallet to give away your Bitcoin that isn't worth very much right now anyway. Might as well give it to Radlib, right? Okay. Anyway, that's enough shilling. Let's get right into this very serious topic. I'm going to start with some of the horrible things that happened, and then we're going to slow down and we're going to go very carefully through an article that documents those first 20 years or so after the takeover of the Bolsheviks in the Soviet Union in 1917. There's about a 22 year period where the persecution is really, really intense. That's not the end of it. There's a post-World War II persecution. But what I'd like to focus on today is what really began about 100 years ago and went for about 20 years. And it was the time at which there was the most, torture, imprisonment, killing, humiliation, all of these sorts of things happened in just a ferocious way in those first about 2 decades of the Soviet Union. So that's what we'll focus on today. This is part of a series on left-wing terror. We're kind of moving around in history, trying to paint the picture that we don't really get from the mainstream because they tend to be sympathetic to the left-wing revolution. And so they don't give us the picture of how brutal left-wing terror has been for a couple hundred years now. So that's really what the series is doing. If you look in the description of the video, you'll see the playlist with the left-wing terror series. We're up to about 5 episodes so far, and we're going to keep going for a while. I think it's an important topic, and I'm surprised it hasn't been covered in quite this way before, but it's a topic that needs to be covered. And one of the themes we've already seen is the persecution of Christians during these episodes of left-wing terror. That's a pretty common theme in what we see. And it really comes to a great climax, I think, here in the early Soviet Union. It's just horrible. Okay, so let's start with I'm just going to basically read this article to you from historycollection.com. In the Soviet Union, priests and nuns were crucified, boiled in tar, and drowned. As Soviet troops moved into white-held territory, the whites were the ones resisting the takeover by the Soviets of the Russian Empire. As Soviet troops moved into white-held territory, they often made no distinction between the civilians and the people they were fighting. If a village was controlled by their enemies, then they assumed that the people who lived there supported them. This meant that they could be considered enemies as well. Often this meant waves of executions, and priests, monks, and nuns were frequent targets. Monasteries and churches were sacked, and those inside were often taken to secluded areas nearby, where they were often forced to dig their own graves before being shot. In one case, a priest who tried to cross himself before his execution had his arm cut off. Other killings were even more brutal. Priests were crucified in a mocking imitation of Jesus. Others were given molten lead to consume as communion. In Voronezh, soldiers got wind that one convent of nuns had been praying for a white victory. They broke down the door to the convent and reportedly boiled the nuns alive in hot tar. In another case, a priest was arrested and dressed in women's clothing. The soldiers then ordered him to dance. When he refused, he was murdered. In Petrograd, a priest was discovered performing a ceremony for people murdered by the Bolsheviks. He and 32 others were driven to a cliff overlooking the sea. There he was allowed to perform last rites for the victims one by one before they were shot and pushed over into the water. In the city of Perm, a priest was arrested by the Cheka, the early version of the KGB, for supporting the whites. They paraded him through the streets before slicing out his eyes. After hours of torture, he was buried alive. Meanwhile, the city's archbishop performed a rite of anathema on the Bolsheviks for their crimes. A mass killing of the city's clergy followed shortly afterward as revenge. Sorry for the graphic images and descriptions here, but this is a rough one. Anyone who spoke out against the murders was targeted for death, and often even trying to collect the body of a murdered priest for burial was a death sentence. In one case, the wife of an Orthodox priest came to the Cheka to ask for her husband's body. She was murdered on the spot, and her body was mutilated before being left to rot. Meanwhile, the Soviets were beginning to shut down Orthodox churches and putting them to new use as warehouses or Bolshevik headquarters. There were even reports of drunken orgies taking place in the shuttered buildings. Everywhere, the Bolsheviks were attempting to stamp out centuries of Russian religious culture. Medieval churches and cathedrals were simply dynamited. The bodies of saints were exhumed and declared to be nothing but dusty bones. The persecution against the church continued past the end of the Civil War. It wasn't until World War II, when the Soviets realized the power of the church to help unite the Russian nation, that the persecution was relaxed. In the meantime, tens of thousands of priests were arrested and murdered. But the church endured through the years of violence. Not even the Soviets could destroy the church. Okay, so that serves as an introduction. Let me see if I can smoothly move over to the other thing I want to do here. Here we go. This is it. Yeah. Okay. This is the Church in the Soviet Union, 1917 to 1941, by N.S. Timoshev. This article actually is from 1941. Let's see, it was in the Russian Review, Volume 1, Number 1, November 1941. And so I'm following academic agents' advice by using material written before World War II, which is really good advice when you can draw from earlier sources. One person on Twitter said, surely this isn't, I said that this was the greatest persecution that I know of Christians. And he said, surely not greater than during the Roman Empire. Well, if you look at it purely from the point of view of people killed, I think it is. I just was speaking a couple weeks ago on the early church, and the best guess we have is that perhaps 1,000 Christians were executed by the Roman Empire in those first couple hundred years of persecution of the church. Now, many other things were done, right? But in terms of martyrs who actually were killed, were murdered. That's the picture we have, 1,000, a couple thousand maybe. As we'll see as we go through the story, and at the end, as I draw a little bit from Wikipedia, the numbers are quite a bit larger here. Okay, so this is a pretty scholarly article, but I think it's important because he's just going to walk us through carefully the different phases of persecuting the church, then changing tactics, then stopping for a while, then persecuting the church again, right? So this 2-decade period, there's ups and downs in it, and one really surprised me. I have to say, well, there's one I wouldn't have guessed this way. Okay, Church in the Soviet Union from 1917 to 1941. This was a paper actually published in 1941, as becomes clear near the end, where he's clearly talking in the context of, the early part of World War II. So, okay, yeah. Well, first of all, just to make sure we're all on the same page to start this. For more than 9 centuries, Russia had been a nation for which Christianity in its Greek Orthodox form was one of the fundamental principles of life. Very important to understand in this whole story that Eastern Orthodox, he calls it in its Greek Orthodox form, the Eastern Orthodox, as we sometimes say, Christianity had been well established in Russia for almost a millennium, and it was everywhere. It was ubiquitous in Russia. There were churches everywhere. There were priests everywhere. There were monasteries everywhere. This was like, Europe before the French Revolution, England before Henry VIII seized church property. This was the continuation of a sort of medieval level of Christianity being in public life. Okay, so that's where Russia is when the Bolsheviks take over. Christianity is all over the place in Russia. And in case you somehow missed this, a basic doctrine of communism is its militant atheism. This is the Marxist form of socialism, which turned from some of the early Christian variants, Christian socialists and utopian socialists. One of the things he injected into the socialist tradition was militant atheism. And so that's what Lenin and Stalin were really looking to, was that militantly atheist form of socialism, or what we typically call communism with a capital C in the 20th century, right? Okay, so that sets the stage. Let's get into this. Okay, the methods of the persecution of Christianity by communism in the Soviet Union varied greatly. The original plan was derived from the Marxist conception of religion, which is that religion is maintained by the upper classes because it assists them in oppressing and exploiting the proletariat. This is, Marx, religion is the opiate of the masses, right? So it's top down, it's imposed by the elite. And so if we deprive the support of the church, which it had enjoyed in Imperial Russia, then the church would crumble away. Now, by the way, this is not entirely insane. You may think that they sort of, how could they think such a thing? This is not entirely insane. In my speech on the early church a couple weeks ago, I noted that the Greco-Roman paganism was very much propped up by taxes, the temples and so forth, as opposed to voluntary donations like the early church. And so when they eventually stopped funding paganism, it took a real blow. It really did. Now, that wasn't, the total end of paganism, as my neo-pagan friends will be quick to point out, but it did really make a huge difference to withdraw state support in the very, very late part of the Roman Empire there. So, this wasn't a completely nutty idea. And so in January 23rd, 1918, so this is what, Krasny Oktyabr, so this is, a couple months, several months. So really right at the beginning of, well, they hadn't really consolidated power. They were in a civil war, right? But they had control in some areas of Russia. And so right away, they start on the attack. They separated church and state, and they secularized education. And they dispossessed the church. No church or religious society has the right to own property, the decree said. Such societies do not enjoy the right of a juridical person. So the church as an institution could not own property. So this was, made it hard to organize church life when the church could not own any property. All church property had to become the property of individuals who acted as trustees of the church. The second element of this plan that they kicked into right off the bat was the reduction of priests and other ministers to a state of social inferiority. So rather than, I assume, some kind of place of honor in imperial Russian life, instead they were Article 65 of the Constitution of July 10th, 1918 proclaimed them to be non-workers and servants of the bourgeoisie. They were deprived of the franchise. When ration cards were introduced, they generally did not receive those cards. They were not allowed to become members of trade unions. This prevented them from earning money to supplement the meager sums which their parishioners could give them. They had to pay higher rents for their living quarters as well as a high income tax. Their children were deprived of the right to be educated in secondary schools and universities. So they were very much put on a level of clergy were put on second-class citizen status, right? Okay, third element of their attack was the destruction of the influence of the church on the younger generation. So the teaching of religion was prohibited in state, public, and private schools by the decree of January 23rd, 1918. In June 1921, the teaching of religion to private groups of more than 3 children was also prohibited. So you couldn't just have an after-school little get-together and teach them religion, right? Legally, you couldn't. So even during this first period, the first couple years here, during the Civil War period, the local authorities, encountering the unexpected passive resistance of the people, pressed harder. So they were surprised, right? They thought, we'll withdraw the support of the state for the church and it'll crumble away. But instead, they saw that the people were quietly just continuing to be Christians, continuing to practice Christianity. So they went for more drastic measures, such as executing bishops and priests, imprisoning or exiling them, closing churches by force, and desecrating the objects of religious veneration. We'll get into a little more detail on some of these sorts of things that were done, but let's just get through sort of the policies, the rhythm of the policies through these 2 decades. But these measures were sporadic, and the central authorities did not think direct religious persecution was the best plan overall. Then, and here's the one that I did not expect and really surprised me. In March 1921, with the introduction of the new economic policy, there was a partial restoration of capitalistic methods of production and exchange, right? So Russians were starving due to war conditions and due to the Soviets trying to press right into communism. And I think they even tried to abolish money at one point. Anyway, it was really nuts. And as any student of economics could tell you, it ended up with people starving and just misery. And so they backed under Lenin in 21. They introduced the new economic policy. So you might think, hey, this is an era of liberalization. That's kind of how I thought about it because of the economic liberalization. But no, as a counterpart to the new economic policy, they decided to increase pressure on the ideological front, largely in the form of a direct attack on religion, especially on the Greek Orthodox and the Roman Catholic churches. In this article, he uses Greek Orthodox to, I'm a little confused. Is he referring to the Russian Orthodox Church? Because earlier anyway, I'm a little confused about that. But then in February 26, 1922, and remember that's 100 years ago, so this is a particularly critical year, I think, in the attack on the church. They ordered the churches to surrender all articles of gold, silver, and precious stones because there were people starving in the eastern part of Russia, and hey, we need to get those and sell them and feed the people, right? The Patriarch Tikhon replied 2 days later. He said they could not give away sacred objects. In another article, it's not here, but in another article, it's mentioned that he said, but if it isn't involved in worship, then we're willing to, he took a sort of a compromise position, right? Then, we want to help, right? But the government insisted they wanted the sacred objects, right? And it said believers offered to pay for the value of the objects in question. Please don't take the sacred vessels from our church. We will give you money. We will make up for it somehow to contribute to this hunger relief, right? But they wouldn't hear of that. So many clergymen and laymen were brought to trial. 45 executions have been reported, among them that of the Metropolitan Benjamin of Petrograd. An attempt was made to create a schism within the Orthodox Church itself. So some bishops and priests didn't approve of the policy of Patriarch Tikhon. They created something called the Living Church. The communist government thought, okay, here's what we'll do. We'll have a church that's sort of aligned with us, and we'll draw people into that and away from the original church. And so the Patriarch was arrested. The Living Church was allowed to convoke an all-Russian council, even though that had been denied the Orthodox Church, and a bunch of church buildings were turned over to the Living Church. This situation, however, was short-lived. Okay, now this gets to one of my favorite parts of this. I wish I could tell even more of this story, but you'll get it as we go through this. They keep trying to, persecute and destroy the church, and they keep failing. Basically, right? So here's another failure. The Living Church, though headed by several bishops and priests, remained without a flock. Its churches stood empty. Nobody was interested in the proceedings and resolutions of its council. So they got a few leaders to go along with them, and the lay people just didn't go for it. And then this Living Church broke up into several factions, and they began to struggle against one another and became an irrelevancy, right? Okay. So the Patriarch was released from prison, Patriarch Tikhon, in 1923. Most of the rebels among the clergy performed an act of penance, and they were pardoned by the head of the church and received back into it. And until his death in 1925, the Patriarch exercised his authority and enjoyed the love of his faithful flock. So here we are, 1917, we're 8 years, about 7.5 years into the Communist Revolution. The Patriarch's still around. He still has respect. The people are still looking to him as their religious leader. Things aren't going so well for the commies. Okay, so the events of June 1923 signified the breakdown of the first direct attack against religion. The communist government, having realized the authority of the church was still very great, despite all the persecution, and we'll detail a little more about the horrible things that happened in these years, they prohibited the election of a new patriarch. Right? I mean, Patriarch Tikhon's getting old. He dies 2 years later after this point, and they won't let them set up a new patriarch, right? The acting patriarchs who followed Tikhon were successively imprisoned until 27, when the last of them, Metropolitan Sergius, was able to negotiate a compromise and retain his position. And I'm not enough in the Orthodox world to comment on, what the Orthodox believers would feel about Sergius. Like, did he compromise too much? Or, I can't speak to that. Okay. Now, an organization was founded in 1925, which was to play an important part through these next 15 years. the League of Militant Atheists. I mean, it sounds like it's something out of a comic book, right? The League of Militant Atheists. Their primary function was to undermine faith by means of desecration. That is, by organizing anti-religious processions, carnivals, and other performances on church holidays, especially in the vicinity of church buildings. So the idea is, hey, they want, bread and circuses, we'll give it to them. When they traditionally would have all gotten together for some church holiday, we'll give them something else to do. We'll make it fun. We'll probably make fun of the church a bit while we're at it, right? And we'll draw people away from the church. They just have it. People have a need to, get together occasionally and do something, right? So we'll just give them something else to do. But that failed. So this became so obvious that in 1929 to 1930, the government inaugurated a new policy. And this policy consisted of a renewal of direct attack. So in other words, in 25, the League of Militant Atheists, the idea is we're going to kind of persuade people, right? We're going to do alternate sort of anti-religious events. We're going to propagandize them and teach their children stuff, and we're going to wean them off religion, right? Wean them off Christianity. But after several years, they're like, okay, this is doing nothing. So we're going to just attack them again. So they tried a new method, which might be termed cultural strangulation. So there was a mass closing of churches. In the course of a few months, thousands of churches were closed in the cities and in the countryside, and particularly in the districts where wholesale collectivization was being introduced. So this is interesting, right? Because this, as I've spoken about on this in a previous episode, we've discussed the mass murders through state-engineered famine during the collectivization period, starting around 1929. You might have heard of the Holodomor. That's a newer term for me. But it's basically an attempt to, borrow from the Holocaust terminology and draw attention to the killing of the people in the Ukraine. The Ukraine and other Black Earth regions. Our friend J. Otto Pohl has done great work in regards to the effect on Germans that were in the Russian Empire and then in the Soviet Union, and how they were particularly targeted on basically an ethnic basis. That had an effect over in Germany, which is worth thinking about. But anyway, so along with the collectivization, along with the state-engineered famine, in these districts where they're pressing on these people, they're also closing their churches, right? A campaign was started for the burning of icons and for the removal of church bells. The church bell thing is really big. I think I remember seeing a memo, a telegram from Lenin that he sent over to some region saying, shoot the priests, grab the church bells, that'll be worth such and such amount of money, and we need the money. The icons are particularly significant in Orthodox religious practice. If you've seen Jonathan Peugeot on YouTube, he makes icons, and he has very well described the significance of icons in the Orthodox understanding. So, the burning of icons is a very direct attack. Now, this is something I did not know about. I was just telling Academic Agent about this, and he didn't either. A 6-day week was introduced by a decree of September 24th, 1929. I'm going to give it away. This went on for 11 years. Okay. Now, it was introduced as an economic measure. We need to work more, basically. We need to get rid of the weekend and just, one day of rest instead of two, whatever. We need to work. But also, obviously, it was an attack on Sunday. Voskresenia, hopefully I'm remembering my Russian right. Resurrection Day is the word for Sunday in Russian. So it made it difficult for workers to attend church on Sunday, unless Sunday happened to coincide with the 6th or rest day of the new week, which I learned when I looked up this crazy scheme. The rest day wasn't even the same for everybody. So it was a 6-day week, but it wasn't the same throughout the Soviet Union. It depended on what sector you were working in or something like that. So, your whole town or your whole city wouldn't even be on the same 6-day schedule, day of rest schedule. And they kept this up for 11 years. So the church was to be deprived of much of its spiritual influence. Okay, I'm really struck by this passage because in my recent speech in England on the early church, one of the things I highlighted was the importance of being full service, as Rodney Stark put it. That is, when you are, when the church was offering what it was offering to people in the Roman Empire, it really ended up offering not just, hey, come and have a worship service once a week. That's sort of how we think of church now, often, but it was a place for mutual aid. It was a place for social gatherings. It was offered you, the things you needed from community life were available to you through the Christian church. So with that in mind, listen to what they forbid in 1929. They forbade religious societies, that is parishes, to form mutual aid associations and cooperatives, to use their property for anything other than religious needs. Okay. This may not be familiar to many of you because this got wiped out about 100 years ago by the progressives and the Fabians, but it used to be that mutual aid was very, very common in larger European society, in the United States, everywhere. Often in religious organizations, sometimes also in, people who were in the same trade or something. But the point is, this pattern of mutual aid was very common in European society, and only in the last 100 years has it been replaced with state welfare, which, as we all know, is just a complete disaster, right? So they were forbidden to give material aid to their members, to organize special prayers or other meetings for children, young people, and women, as well as Bible classes, to do literary work and handwork, to organize groups or meetings of workers or others, or excursions, to open playgrounds, libraries, and reading rooms, to operate sanitaria, and to offer medical aid. Think about how many hospitals you know of that are called St. John's or St. Mary's or something like that, right? The church, especially in the medieval era, became a source of medical institutions, hospitals, and so forth, right? In addition, a constitutional amendment was put into effect in 29, abolishing free competition between religious thought and anti-religious propaganda, though more in word than in fact. Actually, it did end something significant, which we'll find out soon. The relegation of all active lay members of the church to a plane of social inferiority was also part of the new plan. So remember, there was social inferiority for the clergy 10 years earlier, early on in the Soviet period, but now the lay people are going to have this be second-class citizens as well. So what did this mean? For years, no opportunity was given to faithful Christians for advancement, either in the administration or in professional careers, which very important because there were private enterprise was not permitted in the Soviet Union. So if, state employment was all there was, and if you were being, treated, you weren't given opportunities for advancement in state employment, there wasn't like an alternative, right? Now, they switched also in 1929 from non-religious education, sort of secular education, to anti-religious education. Textbooks were introduced in schools showing the incompatibility of science and religion and the class roots of religious ideas. Back to this idea that religion is, foisted upon the masses by the elite to fool them and manipulate them and so forth. All teachers were compelled to use every opportunity to help pupils to become convinced atheists. In the decree of April 8th, 1929, they abolished the right to teach religion to groups of fewer than 4 children. Remember, before you could teach a few children, but not more than a few. Now, and that right had continued until 1929, but that was ended. So only the parents could teach religion at this point to children. So the first part of the 1929-1930 plan, the direct attack, once more proved to be a failure. Peasants resisted collectivization, not only because they did not want to lose their economic freedom, but also because it was combined with the closing of the churches. So this is an aspect that I didn't even highlight when we discussed the collectivization, the Holodomor. I was looking at it from the point of view of the property attack on property, but it was combined with an attack on their local churches. And so that strengthened their resistance to the whole deal, right? You're attacking our ability to, feed ourselves and not starve, and you're attacking our faith directly, So in March 1930, they decided they needed to lessen the tension a bit, and they acknowledged that they'd gone too far in closing local churches, and they forbade that. Okay. So the cultural strangulation component of the plan, though, was carried out up to the years 1934 to 1935. So we're talking about a 5 to 6 year period. And then began a new period where there were some concessions. Anti-Easter and anti-Christmas carnivals were gradually discontinued. In 1935, the population once more had the joy of lighting their Christmas trees, which had been forbidden for many years. Okay, so 1935, we're talking 18 years after the Red October, right? So they're really backing off here. Let's see. In August 1937, they did a third direct attack against the church. And this cracked me up. This attack was caused by the enactment of the new Constitution. Officially, this Constitution was proclaimed to be the most democratic in the world. Anyway, and maybe it was, right? So the leaders of the church once more became implacable enemies of the social reconstruction, whereas the rank and file of the believers were assumed to be honest and loyal members of the socialist society, a significant difference from the previous attacks. So what they're saying is, though originally, they really started with the leadership, they quickly moved to just persecuting Christians in general. In this wave in 37, they decided to go after the leadership again. So a number of bishops and priests were arrested and tried for conspiracy to overthrow the Soviet regime, for concrete hostile acts such as setting fire to factories, they're wreckers, right? Saboteurs. Sometimes priests were accused of stealing church property or of immoral conduct. An even greater number of churches than in 1929 to 1930 was closed. About 10,000 out of the 30,000 Orthodox parishes, which had existed before this, were abolished, only to be replaced, it is true, by an equal number of unregistered, secret, and illegal organizations, the underground church. I remember I was actually old enough that I was around when the Soviet Union was still around, and I remember someone coming and giving us a presentation about the underground church in the Soviet Union when I was young. So this would have been possibly the 70s, maybe the early 80s. And they held it after our normal service and had to sort of vet that these were like regular members of the church, and told us, no pictures. We don't want anyone because they showed us some photos. We don't want anything to get back, and these people end up being persecuted because their identity is revealed. So then this third wave that started in 37, 38 ended as suddenly as it began. January 1939 marks the introduction of what may be called the new religious policy. And so the Historical Institute of the Academy of Sciences and of the Central Committee of the League of Militant Atheists held a joint session, during which a paper by Professor Ranovich was discussed. Ranovich said that Christianity had played an important part in the struggle against slavery. It had proclaimed the equality of man, regardless of race and social status. It had introduced a revolutionary and democratic spirit into human relations, and this was accepted by the joint session. A little later, the League of Militant Atheists acknowledged that the teaching of the gospel concerning the love for one's neighbor was accepted by all the workers of the world. And thus, the deceptive left-wing kind of embrace of Christianity as being a left-wing thing is promulgated, and some of my friends in the dissident right accept it to this day. And I will say that to your face. Okay. Okay. Right. And then, on and on, various ways that they tried to sort of say, oh, yeah, well, we can get along with Christianity now, suddenly, after 20 years of trying to destroy it, right? And then they also explained that the struggle against religion, though it was, they explained Lenin and Stalin always rebuked the communists who considered that the struggle against religion was necessary in all circumstances. That is, yes, strategically we need to do that, but tactically we might back off for various reasons, right? It might have to be subordinated to considerations of general policy, namely, we're about to be invaded potentially, and we gotta not keep pissing everybody off by attacking their faith. Okay, so the Soviet government permitted citizens in 1939 to profess. They permitted them to profess any religion and not to discriminate on religious grounds. So they had a principle of tolerance, completely tactical, avowedly tactical. So these instructions were first issued in January 1938. They said it's the anti-religious policy has been overdone. The activities of the League of Militant Atheists had to be subordinated to other more acute political problems. All attempts to liquidate religion at once were to be stopped. And so I'll say a little more, but let's bracket this then. So starting from right away, right, January 1918, as you may recall, going up to, I didn't even notice, January 1938. So literally January 1918 to January 1938, there's on again, off again attempts to destroy the January 1938. And then the threat of war with Germany has them really back off. Okay. So we'll finish up sort of this these last few years getting into the war period that are covered in the article. And then we'll talk about, go back through and put a little more color on what happened. Okay, so in those 20 years. All right, so in 1940, additional instructions were published. It says the League of Militant Atheists made a mistake. They had acted on the premise that religion derived its power from the ignorance of the masses and from their betrayal. This was incompatible with the doctrine of Lenin and Stalin, who always stressed that religion was rooted in social conditions, right? So, you're not being doctrinaire Marxists. You need to look at the economic situation, right? Because they're like economic determinists, the Marxists, right? If people are satisfied with their life on earth, they have no reason to implore the help of heaven. That is the point around which the activity of the League should be concentrated. The League should explain to the workers that their position is very satisfactory. So the way we will get rid of the yearning for religion is that we will tell people that they're doing great. Blow smoke, so to speak. We'll tell people that everything's great, and then they'll realize, they don't really need religion because they're actually doing okay. Because the only reason you'd want religion is because you're of your economic situation, right? So some small concessions were made. As I emphasized, the icons are so important, right? So the restoration of old icons was permitted, very significant. Oil for burning in lamps before the icons was again sold. The custom of giving children Christian names ceased to be compatted. Their excuse was many revolutionists had Christian names, so it's okay, it's kosher. Very significant is the fact that when, under the pressure of circumstances, the Soviet government abandoned the 6-day week and returned to the usual week, Sunday was made the rest day. So they went back to the 7-day week, and they even let Sunday be the rest day again. The leaders of the League of Militant Atheists said, no, let's just pick a different day, so we can kind of keep on attacking Sunday, right? But it was disregarded, and they just decided to stick with Sunday. Okay, is there anything else I wanted to mention? I mean, obviously, you know what happens next. the alliance with National Socialist Germany, the mid-century Germans in 1939 to 1941, right? And the Soviets take over Poland, but they actually don't. That their policy of toleration extends into Poland when they take it over, which is interesting. So religious worship was free, relatively free for Soviets. Let's see, and they denied rumors of religious persecution, honestly, because that's just not what they were doing tactically at the time. Yeah, so following statement made by Cardinal Hland of Poland is of interest. This is from about like when they were occupied by the Soviets, I think. The policy adopted by Bolsheviks in eastern Poland is to avoid massacres and other barbaric methods in favor of others more subtle and efficient, already tested by experience. As a consequence, the Russians seek to undermine the importance of the church, to degrade the clergy, and above all, to educate the youth to atheism and communism. For this reason, there are no organized massacres of priests. So recognize the language here. He's saying, tactically, they've decided it just doesn't, the frontal assault on the church just doesn't work out. It gets everybody to rally round. It creates martyrs, right? So we need to be more subtle. We need to use propaganda. We need to use our control of education. Let's see. They impoverish the clergy. Yeah, the propaganda for atheism is done through slogans coming from Moscow. It is not so gross as in the early days of the Soviet regime. Atheism is preached scientifically. Repugnant blasphemy has been replaced by skillful skepticism, which is instilled especially into the children. The banning of religion from schools is applied gradually. The cross is in some cases permitted to remain in schoolrooms, but it must be placed between portraits of Stalin and Lenin. So I guess they're trying to do a little syncretism on their way to atheism, right? Anyway, I found that passage very interesting. Hopefully it's the reason I found that passage interesting is obvious to you. Okay, so anything else I want to highlight? Right, after the annexation of the Baltic states, this really gives us a sense of really the failure of the anti-Christian campaign. So after the annexation of the Baltic states, Yaroslavsky discussed the prospects of atheism in these newly acquired areas. Since 22 years have not been enough to liquidate the church in the USSR, we shall have many difficulties in extirpating the remains of religious prejudices in the Baltic countries. And so the partial compromise with religion, our author here says, may be explained first in terms of the general trend of cultural life in Russia during the past few years. Because the efforts to introduce a new, purely proletarian culture had failed, the communist government had attempted to impose on Russia a mixture of the old national culture and Marxism, the latter replacing the Christian elements of the former. So we're going to kind of roll with Christian nationalism again. I'm sorry, Russian nationalism, but we'll just take the Christian part out. Problem is, this proved to be impossible. Yeah, in fact, let me share what he says at length here, because I think this is quite interesting. Essential parts in culture complexes cannot be artificially interchanged. You know, like, let's take the United States of America. Hey, it's pretty good. You know, we like, you know, the way the economics works. We like the American, you know, can-do spirit. We just want to swap Christianity for Islam. We'll just do, you know, plug and play, right? And he's saying, culture doesn't really work that way. It's too intertwined and intertwingled, right? Within the general trend, religion formed a lag of major importance, for Russian culture is more deeply rooted in religion than the culture of any other modern nation. Remember what I said about how ubiquitous Orthodox Christianity had been in Russia. Consequently, either an interruption of the general restorative trend, restorative meaning kind of bringing back old Russian culture because their attempts to like create a de novo proletarian culture had failed. So they either had to give up on going back to Russian culture, or they had to extend that to tolerating religion, to letting religion come back, right? And so he says, writing in 1941, events of the last few years show that the latter alternative has been chosen for the time being. And I'll briefly talk about how it didn't last. This choice may be explained by the increasing danger implied in the international situation. The new religious policy is mainly a result of this danger. This, I think, everyone understands, right? Throughout the years 1939 and 1941, the communist government has been under the pressure of the anticipated conflict with Germany. When the Russo-German War broke out in 1941, the government attempted a further conciliation with religion. And so acting patriarch Sergius, you might remember he was the patriarch that they finally let be a patriarch. He gave a message ordering prayer and patriotic endeavor to defeat the enemy of Russia and humanity. So they're like, hey, there, he's supporting the war effort, so we'll let him be a prominent public figure again, I guess. On August 21st, 1941, the Moscow radio called upon, quote, all God-loving inhabitants of the occupied territories to rise in defense of their religious freedom and charged the German regime with menacing the very existence of Christianity. So no atheists in foxholes, right? Suddenly we have God-loving inhabitants again after over 20 years of trying to destroy them. A month later, the Bezbožnik, a weekly publication of the League of Militant Atheists, was discontinued, and a few days later, the Anti-Religioznik, the League's monthly, was also discontinued, leaving the League almost without a means of propaganda. So, in other words, 1941, we're at war with Germany, we're dropping the anti-religion crap. we need to get everybody on board with the war effort, right? Okay, so what happened then? I'm going to go back and give a few more details from Wikipedia on this 20-year period of attacks on the church. This is not the end of persecution of Christians in the Soviet Union. There were more happened in the 50s, and I think again in the 70s. Anyway, I'm not going to cover that period today, the post-World War II period. There were other attacks, but my understanding, and happy to have someone tell me that I'm wrong, and I'll do better in the future to cover it. My understanding is that we did not see the kind of torture, killing of priests, nuns, monks, lay Christians, and so forth that we saw in that those first 2 decades of the Soviet Union. There was closing of churches. There was, sort of cultural disabilities for being a Christian. Some imprisonment happened, but the kind of all-out, we are just going to kill the Christians, and that's how we'll get rid of Christianity. I don't think that really resumed after the end of World War II. Okay, so let's go to one more thing. It is Wikipedia, but they do have some good details in here. One of them being right here on the front. This is a particular personal interest for me. You see a picture of the demolition of the Cathedral of Christ the Savior in Moscow on the orders of Joseph Stalin, the 5th of December, 1931. I was very honored to be able to visit the new Cathedral of Christ the Savior in 2001. It had just been recently rebuilt. With the Soviet Union having been gone for 10 years. I'm sorry, I don't remember when it was rebuilt, because it was done by the time I got there in 2001. But I got to visit it, and I had some inkling of the significance of this. They had demolished it, as you see in this picture, a glorious cathedral, and replaced it with a swimming pool. When I visited the cathedral, they had really tried to, as I understand it, I guess they had good records and pictures and stuff. They tried to really just make it as if it had never been demolished. And there's a lot of tributes to the war with Napoleon in that cathedral. So for those who are war buffs, if you're ever in Moscow, the cathedral is worth visiting for its own sake. And also, I think you'll find the walls quite fascinating, what they have on the walls. Okay. So, okay. Just wanted to highlight a few details. I thought that article was excellent at giving us the waves of persecution, but it lacked a little bit in sort of the brutality of what was done. So starting, we're going to go back through the period real quick and just give a little more detail, and then I'll be done. The anti-religious campaign from 1917 to 1921, the Civil War period. Patriarch Tikhon of Moscow excommunicated the Soviet leadership on January 19th, 1918, for conducting this campaign of separation of church and state, which we had already done. Well, yeah, January 1918, right? So that's when they're starting the focused persecution. Sorry, getting distracted by friends. Okay. In retaliation, the regime arrested and killed dozens of bishops, thousands of the lower clergy and monastics, and multitudes of laity. The seizing of church property of the next few years would be marked by a brutal campaign of violent terror. During the Russian Civil War, many clerics were killed. Some were executed by state security services for supporting the White Armies. For those who are interested in the Civil War, I'm going to skip some detail here, but it's quite interesting to look at the role of the church with the Civil War, because the church generally was sympathetic with the whites, right? It was sympathetic with the anti-Bolshevik side. The estimate of 330 clergy and monastics killed by 1921 may have been an underestimate, due to the fact that 579 monasteries and convents had been liquidated during this period, and there were widespread mass executions of monks and nuns during these liquidations. As I mentioned already, and in the marketing, it's estimated that 8,000 religious, monks, nuns, priests, were executed in 1922 alone. So that gives you the idea. Okay, what else want to highlight? Most of the clergy reacted toward the Russian Revolution with open hostility. Tikhon anathematized the Soviet government and called believers to fight against it and its decrees. It is better to shed one's blood and to be awarded a martyr's crown than to let the enemies desecrate Orthodox faith, said the appeal from Tikhon. So, the church did resist in the sense of saying, your attacks on the church are, we're not going along with it, right? And then Tikhon never gave his blessing to white forces, though, and he declared neutrality during the Civil War. Propaganda at the time claimed that this was a camouflage for the church's real position, which was supposedly support for return of Tsarism. But the fraudulence of this later Soviet revision is clearly shown through the fact that none of the documented acts of brutalities against members of the clergy by the Reds involved anyone who actually took up arms with the whites, and only few of them were cases of clergy who gave vocal support. The fraudulence of this revisionism was shown even further by the fact that the slicing up of unarmed prisoners, scalping and torturing believers, shooting priests' wives and children, and many other such acts recorded in the documented acts of brutality by the Reds against the Orthodox Church during the Civil War have nothing to do with acting in self-defense. That is something that I'm sorry to be so blunt and explicit in this left-wing terror series. I'm not sorry, but I'm sorry these things happened. And it's hard to talk about them. There's a reason, though, I do, because I want to make sure that people understand that this wasn't just a matter of, regimes are fighting each other, and you attack people that you see as supporters on the other side, or they broke the law, your new law. They broke the law, and you got to bring them to justice, even though they're Christians or priests or nuns or whatever. No, there's what I see throughout the Bolshevik period and also in other instances of left-wing attacks on the church is there's torture, there's cruelty, there's blasphemy. As I mentioned earlier, they make people perform black masses. That is mocking and humiliating and gross versions of the Mass, where instead of the bread and the wine, it's other things that are disgusting. There's cruelty, I guess is what I'm trying to say. There's a layer, a heavy layer of cruelty to the attacks on Christians by left-wingers. It isn't just, hey, sad to do it, but they're in our way of what we're trying to achieve politically, and so we've got to get rid of them. No, they seem to delight in torturing and killing, torturing and killing and imprisoning and doing horrible things to Christians. Yeah, this is quite interesting. Public debates were held between Christians and atheists after the revolution up until they were suspended in 1929. I mentioned that in 1929 they had stopped discussion of, religious versus anti-religious, right? Well, it had been going on, and as is detailed here, I won't go into the debates. Some of the religious debaters were quite good, and these debates would often, it said people would line up for hours in order to get seats to see them, and basically they would get to watch the religious debaters, kick the butts of the Soviet guys, the atheists. And so it's amazing that they let this go on for, over 10 years after the revolution. They were still doing this. Here's an example. Professor V.S. Marcinkovsky, raised as Orthodox, but he'd become an evangelical Protestant, was one of the best on the religious side. And one of the Commissar for Enlightenment, Anatoly Lunacharsky, reportedly canceled one of his debates with Marcinkovsky because he had really lost in the previous debate. On one occasion in 1921, a large crowd of Komsomol, communist youth, hecklers, arrived at one of Marcinkov's debates and occupied the two front rows. When the leader tried to heckle, he found himself unsupported by the rest of the boys. And afterwards, they told the leader that he was not saying what they were told he was going to say. That is, once they actually heard what Marcinkovsky had to say, they were like, "Oh, this makes sense." So, just amazing. I share that. There's so much more I could share because I know a lot about the religious people who continued to be in public life surprisingly late into the Soviet era. And it's a fascinating story how they continued to stand up in the middle of, despite this persecution. When church leaders demanded freedom of religion under the Constitution, the 1921 Constitution, which, you might recall the Soviet Constitution always said, oh yeah, we have freedom of religion. So church leaders said, well, we'd like freedom of religion then. The Bolsheviks responded with terror. They murdered the Metropolitan of Kiev and executed 28 bishops and 6,775 priests. Despite mass demonstrations in support of the church, repression cowed most ecclesiastical leaders into submission. So, a lot of martyrs in the best sense of that term, which is not just about like getting killed for your faith. It's about standing firm under persecution. Whether that means you get killed or not is not the point of martyrdom, really. Martyr is a witness, someone who bears witness, even when they're under pressure to deny their faith, right? And they refuse to deny their faith despite social and being second-class citizens or being tortured or whatever. They refuse to deny it. That's what a martyr is, and that's why I say that this is the Great Martyrdom. Okay. Oh, little detail here that struck me. Leon Trotsky wanted Patriarch Tikhon to be killed, but Lenin forbade it for fear it would produce another patriarch who'd become like a hero, I guess, to Russians. So he said, Tikhon's gonna become a Russian folk hero if we kill him, so don't kill him. And they didn't, by the way. They killed many others. Tikhon just died of natural causes after various imprisonments. Okay, what else do I want to highlight? Let's see. There were rumors circulated that Jews were running the Soviet Supreme Church administration. And for this reason, Lenin forbade Trotsky from involvement, because Trotsky was Jewish, with the campaign and prevented certain key roles being given to those of Jewish descent. So, as you may know, there were a lot of Jewish Bolsheviks in various high positions. And Trotsky, most famously, was probably the top most important political position held by someone of Jewish descent. And Lenin was like, this is not going to work, guys, if you're running the church apparatus, or involved with the running of the church apparatus. So you can't do that. But notice how Trotsky just wanted to kill Tikhon, right? He wanted to be the most brutal there. Trotsky, it's worth noting, is the ideological father to a great degree of the neocons, who I never cease attacking because they're terrible. Okay. Then there was an incident in a town, there was a bloody incident, and Lenin said, okay, good. This gives us a chance to attack the church. Otto von Radowitz, the counselor at the German embassy in Moscow, recorded that the campaign was a deliberate provocation to get the clergy to react in order to attack it in response. So it was trying to get the church to, give it an excuse, right? So Lenin outlined that the entire issue of the church valuables campaign could be used as a pretext in the public eye to attack the church and kill clergy. So the sixth sector of the OGPU, again a KGB precursor, I think, led by Yevgeny Tuchkov, began aggressively arresting and executing bishops, priests, and devout worshippers such as Metropolitan Veniamin in Petrograd in 1922 for refusing to hand over sacred relics, church valuables, right? Archbishop Andronik of Perm, who worked as a missionary in Japan, was shot after being forced to dig his own grave. Bishop Germogen of Tobolsk, who voluntarily accompanied the Tsar into exile, was strapped to the paddle wheel of a steamboat and mangled by the rotating blades. In 1922, the Solovki camp, the dreaded Solovki camp of special purpose, the first Russian concentration camp in a former Orthodox monastery, was established in the Solovki Islands in the White Sea. In the years 1917 to 1935, 130,000 Russian Orthodox priests were arrested. 95,000 were put to death, executed by firing squads. Father Pavel Florinsky, a mathematical genius, exiled in 1928 and executed in 1937, was one of the new martyrs of this particular period. In the first 5 years after the Bolshevik Revolution, an English journalist estimated that 28 bishops and 1,215 priests were executed. Recently released evidence indicates over 8,000 were killed, as I mentioned, in 1922 during the conflict over church valuables. So think about it this way. Maybe you don't care much about the execution of priests, arrest and execution of priests, but when they're killing 95,000 priests, what do you think they're doing to everybody else, right? It gives you an indication of how vicious the attack was, and how I'm sure how probably a multiple of religious people were attacked. And in my view, the collectivization, the Holodomor, the collectivization campaign and all the death there, in my view, many of those people would count as martyrs. They were Christians who, as we've seen, as we've gone through this, despite all these efforts by the Soviet government, they would not abandon their faith. And finally, Stalin just decided, I'm going to break them. I'm going to break these regions that are being so, these kulaks, right? The deplorables. I'm going to break the deplorables. They will not go along with my policies. They will not give up their faith. I'm going to starve them. And he did it. And they died in tremendous numbers. Okay, I think that might be... Okay, yeah, a little bit more. I mentioned about the anti-religious events they would hold. Just a little more detail on that. The Komsomol, the communist youth, would hold crude, blasphemous Komsomol Christmases and Komsomol Easters, headed by hooligans dressed as Orthodox clergy. The processions would include the burning of icons, burning of religious books, mock images of Christ and the Virgin, etc. The propaganda campaign, however, was a failure, and many people remained with their religious convictions. The church held its own public events with some success. and competed well with the anti-religious propaganda during these years. So literally, you could go over to the anti-religious event, or you could go to the religious event. And so people like voted with their feet, right? Revealed preference. So moving on to the 30s again, a little more detail here. The Orthodox Church suffered terribly in the 1930s. Many of its members were killed or sent to labor camps. Between 1927 and 1940, the number of Orthodox churches in the Russian Republic fell from about 30,000 to fewer than 500. Let me say that one more time. Between 1927 and 1940, the number of Orthodox churches in Russia, not the Soviet Union overall, but Russia specifically, fell from about 30,000 to fewer than 500. The watershed year was 1929, when Soviet policy put much new legislation in place that formed the basis for the harsh anti-religious persecution in the 1930s, which we've gone through some of that. Let's see, but the resistance all through. This is the story of persecution and also the story of martyrs, people bearing witness, people continuing to hold on to their faith, continuing to circulate religious material illegally through samizdat, right? We think the West, I think, was presented with samizdat as, something where they were passing around liberal stuff, and there was some of that, right? Hayek or whatever, but they're also passing around religious literature. That's something they probably didn't emphasize, right? After 1929 and through the 1930s, the closing of churches, mass arrests of the clergy and religiously active laity, and persecution of people for attending church reached unprecedented proportions. During the purges of 1937 and 1938, church documents record that 168,300 Russian Orthodox clergy were arrested. Of these, 106,000 were shot. Many thousands of victims of persecution became recognized in a special canon of saints known as the New Martyrs and Confessors of Russia. And again, I was honored to see an icon in the church in Moscow, Church of Christ the Savior, that was dedicated to the New Martyrs and Confessors of Russia. Showed a number of them. Official Soviet figures reported that up to 1/3 of urban and 2/3 of rural population still held religious beliefs by 1937. So after nearly 20 years, especially in the rural areas, a majority of the population was still religious. The anti-religious campaign of the past decade and the terror tactics of the militantly atheist regime had effectively eliminated all public expressions of religion. So there's a lot of underground church stuff, right? And communal gatherings of believers outside of the walls of the few churches that still held services. This was accomplished in a country that only a few decades earlier had had a deeply Christian public life and culture that had developed for almost 1,000 years. So from the point of view of the Soviets, it was a big failure, right? They were figuring they could just get rid of Christianity with these campaigns, and they didn't. But the religious life of the country was just, destroyed in so many ways from what it had been. So, a huge attack on the church by any measure. Okay, I think that's what I wanted to highlight. Let's go to Super Chats. I saw some. First, subscribe star tips. Any there? Okay. Then let's go to Super Chats. Thank you all for sticking with me for some rough material in this left-wing terror series. But frankly, tell me if I'm wrong, and you guys are all like, oh yeah, we know all this stuff. But my feeling is that I have not quite seen anyone put this all together to not only talk about these different episodes in a series, but try to connect some themes and such. What are some of the common themes we see running through these episodes of left-wing terror? Attacks on the church, and one of the themes I see, many other themes that we'll continue to call out as we go. Okay, Lady of Shalat, thank you. Says, Solzhenitsyn's family defied the Soviet anti-religious campaign of the 1920s and remained devout. Solzhenitsyn regained his Orthodox faith in the Gulag. Yeah, what a blessing, right? Sometimes Christian parents feel despair because their children get caught up in the trends and fads of the world. They're caught away by the world. But so often I hear stories like this, that the faithful prayers of family, uh, people often do come back. So don't worry. Solzhenitsyn himself is an example of that story, and I have someone in my life, trying to be very careful here. I have someone in my life whose mother died praying for him, part of an underground church in another place, not Russia, and if you'd pray for him, I'd appreciate it. Okay. Scratchy McDumpwaffle. Actually, I lied. I must have missed something. Was he talking about a previous super chat? Anyway, it says, actually, I lied. Why does the dissident right not like Protestantism? Not a Christian, but grew up in a Protestant household, educated in a Protestant private school, and I don't see how their values are antithetical to ours. Well, I'm Protestant, so I can't explain that. I'm not going to try to respond to that, sir. You'll have to talk to the those who hate Protestantism. I mean, I guess my view on it is that the church is really under attack of the more subtle form that we saw talked about at a certain point there. When they were talking about what they were going to do, and the Soviets were going to do in the Baltic areas, I think it was. Not an outright, shooting priests, but using skepticism and, just offering this other worldview. I think that's what the church is up against now, and I think it's making great inroads. Frankly, I think many people in the church have fallen into heresy because they've embraced basically egalitarianism, which I view as satanic. Did I ever publish that piece yet? Anyway, I have a piece where I explain. No, I do have a piece on my Substack. Look at my Substack if you're interested in that. And right at the beginning of there's only a few pieces there. Right at the beginning of one of the articles, I talk about a way that egalitarianism is worse than a heresy. And I actually have an article in draft that I'm going to publish soon called Egalitarianism Worse Than a Heresy. So I think that Christians are falling into error, and it's happening all over the place, right? In the Catholic Church, in the Orthodox Church, in Protestant churches. And all Christians need to figure out how to fight this. Okay, Ian Sivo. As an Orthodox Christian, thank you for covering these tragic events. You're welcome. Saint Gabriel Urgabadze, a Georgian priest and monk, set fire to a banner of Lenin in 1965 and was confined to a mental hospital. Wow. That's bold. Cringewalker says, I took a lot of photos of that cathedral, Christ the Savior Cathedral in Moscow. I'll send you a few your way later. Thank you. And Chris Raposo says, really enjoying your series. Thanks again for all the research and sharing. You're welcome. What an important tale to tell, right? If we think, like I do, that what is being offered by the left, I guess, if you want to call it that still, but whatever this thing is that we're up against, if you think it's wrong, then I feel like history is so important, right? A lot of people derive things not from theories, political theory, abstract theory, moral theory. They are really, I think it's more common that people are derive their takes on things from an understanding of history, right? And so I think historical work is really important. I really love and support the work of Apostolic Majesty, my co-host Ryan Turnipseed, so many others who are historically minded. We have to tell what, in my view, is the truth. And the truth is that despite the promises of bringing, equality and ending oppression and all these promises that we get from left-wingers, what they actually bring us is terror. And we should stop them. All right. I think that covers it. I think I caught up with all super chats and such. And thank you very much. And remember, in this year, 2022, this year of our Lord 2022, remember the new martyrs and confessors of the Orthodox Church who faced persecution and bore witness despite that about 100 years ago. It's a great year to remember them and to think about what their example means to us in our context. How can we honor their legacy, right? All right. Thank you. We'll be back next week with lighter fare with Econ Minis. I think Black Horse will be able to join us, but we'll take a break from the heavy stuff and then be back to it soon. Thank you, everybody.